Welcome back to the Word on Fire show. I'm Brandon Vaught, the content director at Word on Fire, and with me, as he is every single week, is the founder of Word on Fire, the host of the Catholicism series and the new series, Catholicism, the Pivotal Players, Bishop Robert Barron. Bishop Barron, welcome.
Thanks, Brandon. How you doing today?
Doing very well. We're excited that Pivotal Players has finally gotten off the ground. It seems like it's been months and years since we first started working on this project, but it's finally released. So hopefully a lot of people listening to this, you've already received your DVD, your Blu-ray copy. If not, listen to this. This is going to be important. We have a special coupon code for you. You can go right now to pivotalplayers.com and you can get $10 off with this coupon code. The code is Siena33, and you'll know why we're using that here in a second, but it's S-I-E-N-A, Siena33, all one word. You'll get $10 off the Pivotal Players DVD or Blu-ray set. So you're going to want to check that out. Now, before we get into the main content of this episode, which is on St. Catherine of Siena, one of our pivotal players, I wanted to talk to you, Bishop, about an exciting trip you're going to be taking in a few days back to Rome. You've been to Rome here a few times in the past year or two, but this time you're going for a unique occasion. Tell us why you're heading over there and what you expect.
Well, I'm going to Rome for what they call Baby Bishop School. I shouldn't say they call it that. We call it that. It's a school for those who have been named bishop in the past year. And it's a set of lectures and talks largely by curial officials from the Vatican. And they address all the fellows who have been named bishop this past year. So it's kind of like an orientation to the Vatican and who's who and maybe some basic instruction on being a bishop. We've all been kind of teasing that the three of us here in Los Angeles were ordained now almost exactly a year ago. So we are at least toddler bishops. You know, we've been at this for a long time. We've been through a year of confirmations and everything else. So I'm looking forward to it. It'd be a little bit like a retreat, probably. I think it's 8 days. At the end of this process, we have Mass with the Pope, and I understand we have a chance to meet the Pope and have a photo op and all that. So, you know, I'm looking forward to it.
That'll be great. I know we'll definitely recap everybody on the trip once you get back here.
Yeah, I'll give you an update.
So today, we're going to continue our series on the pivotal players. We're devoting one episode of the Word on Fire show here to each of the 6 pivotal players featured in your film series, Catholicism, the Pivotal Players. And today, we're going to be discussing St. Catherine of Siena. So let's begin, as we typically do, with just a brief biographical sketch. Who was St. Catherine of Siena?
Catherine of Siena was an Italian lady born in 1347. She was the 24th of 25 children. She was a twin, and her twin sister died. So her mother gave birth to 25 children, and Catherine is the youngest. She grows up in this beautiful town of Siena, and very early on, she emerges as a mystic and a visionary. The young girl, no more than 7, has an extraordinary vision of Jesus and a number of saints, as it were, hovering over one of the main churches in Siena. And the extraordinary thing is Jesus appears in the garments and vestments of the Pope. Now, here's a little kid. I mean, yeah, she's a Catholic kid, has been to church and all that, but that she would see Jesus dressed up precisely as the Pope is beyond strange, you know. This is the beginning, though, of a lifelong career, if you want, as a mystic and visionary, someone that lived very close to the transcendent realm. Well, Catherine, after that vision and some other powerful spiritual experiences, kind of vows herself to a life of poverty and simplicity and prayer. And she lives in her room in her house as a kind of recluse, as a kind of nun. Her parents, you know, concerned about her and hoping that she would marry and have a family, et cetera, wondered what's going on. They eventually came to realize this is the real thing. She is someone deeply in touch with God. She joined a group called the Montellate eventually. These were largely widows in Siena who were dedicated to the works of charity and prayer. And she joins the Montellate, who had a kind of Dominican form of spirituality. That's why Catherine is identified very much with the Dominican spiritual family. Well, what happens is really kind of extraordinary to me. In a very brief compass, because she only lives to be 33 years old, in very brief compass, this young spiritual woman is so charismatic, she's so compelling that she gathers around her a familia, she called it, right? A family. And they called her mama, even as a very young woman. And these were, in some cases, priests and elders in the spiritual life who referred to her as mama. The prayer continues, the mysticism, the visions, but also a very deep devotion to the poor and to the sick. Mind you, her life coincides with the worst years of the Black Plague in Europe. This terrible epidemic that claimed the lives of upwards of 1/3 of the entire population of Europe. Staggering to think about. Well, Catherine is there in the midst of it, ministering fearlessly to those with the plague. And then, of course, the most extraordinary thing about her, at least from a ecclesiological standpoint, is her involvement with the Pope. So we're going through this period of the so-called Avignon papacy, when the Pope, for a variety of reasons, largely political, decides to leave Rome and take up residence in Avignon, which is in the territory of the French king. Well, Catherine, along with many others, think of Bridget of Sweden here, felt that key to the renewal of the church, and it was a time of great corruption, and a lot of the saints were calling the church back to its original purity, but she felt that key to that was that the successor of Peter should live in the city of Peter. And so Catherine begins to summon the Pope, but then she goes directly in person to Avignon and successfully convinces the Pope to return to Rome. One of the most extraordinary things in the Middle Ages, I think, is that scene of an unlettered, she was uneducated, by the end of her life could kind of read and write, but not well. This basically unlettered, uneducated woman with no social or ecclesial status convinces the Pope to leave Avignon and come to Rome. Well, Catherine then goes to Rome, and she dies actually in very short order. She died at the age of 33. After a life of intense austerity, poverty, service to the poor, and mystical communion with Christ and the saints. And to this day, she exerts a sort of fascination over the life of the church. And so that's a sketch, anyway, of Catherine.
In the Pivotal Players film series, you note, again, to underscore how shocking this episode was in Avignon, that you have this uneducated, illiterate, young peasant girl who influences what might be the most influential institution in Europe at the time. You know, the church often gets accused of sort of suppressing women, that women don't have any authority or influence. But you've pointed out time and again, look how many women up and down the centuries have played significant roles in the church. Wouldn't you say Catherine is maybe a supreme example?
Yeah, because the church wouldn't necessarily tie power to office. I mean, office is one dimension of the church's life, to be sure, and it does have with it a certain power. But real power always comes from sanctity. So who is the most powerful, who were the most powerful Catholics in the 19th century? I'd say, without doubt, Bernadette of Lourdes and Thérèse of Lisieux, neither of whom had the slightest vestige of worldly or ecclesiastical power, neither one. But yet their contact with God and the things of God gave them extraordinary power. Who is the most powerful Catholic of the 20th century? I don't know if anyone doubts this. More than John the 23rd, more than John Paul II. Mother Teresa of Calcutta is the most powerful Catholic of the 20th century. So true power is tied to sanctity. Now, in the case of Catherine, what I find interesting is, you know, why did she have this influence with the Pope? Well, because she was seen as someone in touch with the heavenly realm. So she wasn't a celebrity. She wasn't a politician. She wasn't ecclesiastically important. She wasn't a pop star of any kind. But she was connected to God and the things of God. And that gave her, in the minds of people in the Middle Ages, an extraordinary authority. And you know what? They were right, because that is more important than being a pop star or being a politico or whatever it is. To be in touch with Christ and the saints, far more important. So I would say I wouldn't patronize the people in her time. I'd praise them. They were right. They had the right judgment of who's really powerful. And the Pope himself knew it. He didn't pull rank on her. He listened to her and eventually obeyed her. So, see, the trouble in our time is we play the game that power simply equals office. That's it. That's the only path to power. I say, come on. That's kid stuff in many ways. And, I'm a person, I hold office. I'm not making fun of it or downing it. But comparatively speaking, it's kid stuff compared to the power that comes from real intimacy with God. And Catherine of Siena had that in spades.
Catherine is probably best known as a mystic, especially through her writings, which have been collected as the Dialogues with God. Talk about these writings and about the God who emerges from them. What sort of God do we discern in these writings?
Yeah, they're extraordinary. The dialogues would not be for someone who's looking for a systematic presentation of the faith. You're not going to get what you find in Thomas Aquinas. They're a bit rambling. They tend to mix metaphors a lot, and they tend to kind of double back on themselves. Not surprising for a woman who is not educated carefully and not disciplined in her communication, but they are filled with this extraordinary intimacy with God the Father. What she's reporting, and I believe her, is her conversations with God. And as the Lord spoke to her, she wrote it down, or immediately thereafter, she wrote it down. So you have the record of someone in deep, intimate contact with Christ, with God the Father, with the saints. And you find that now in these dialogues. The other part of her mystical life, and I've alluded to it, are this experiential dimension. So Catherine would receive communion, for example, and then she'd go into what we'd probably call a trance, with eyes shut, unconscious really to the world, often her fists clenched tightly. They say that people would poke her with needles and this sort of thing while she's in that state, and she showed no reaction whatsoever. They're reminiscent of Bernadette of Lourdes, by the way. In many cases, she levitated. She left the ground. And this is attested to by all kinds of people that saw it. And again, not surprising. You find that in a lot of holy people across the ages. And she'd come back from these trances with the most extraordinary reports of conversations with the Blessed Mother and with Christ and with St. Dominic and with other saints. I think she was someone who was just privileged. She was allowed to receive this great grace of intimacy with the things of heaven. But, here's the thing, and this is where Mother Teresa again comes to mind. It gave rise to an extraordinary devotion to those who suffer. So don't think for a second she was literally floating off on her own, in some kind of just mystical rapture all the time. The mystical rapture led, I'll put it this way, this highest ascent of the Spirit led to the greatest descent into the suffering of the world. I love that in Catherine, and that's where she's reminiscent of Dorothy Day and Mother Teresa and many others. And that's the Christian mark, If you got someone who said, hey, I'm a mystic, I'm in touch with Christ all the time, yeah, well, what's your devotion to the poor? I don't have much to do with the poor. To me, that's ipso facto a sign that you're not really in communion with Christ. Something's happening to you, man, but I don't know what it is. In Catherine's case, I think it was eminently clear.
One major theme we find in Catherine's writings is the image of Christ as bridge. What does this mean?
Yeah, it's lovely. She talks about sin as a raging river. So think of a river that's rolling along and carrying things away, and that's where we're stuck. So who's Christ but the bridge that allows us to get out of the water and climb up? Now, I want you to keep something in mind. We think a bridge is kind of going more horizontally, but you got to think vertically in her case, because if you've been to a place like Florence, you'll see these bridges like the Ponte Vecchio, which is like this big structure. It's got several stories and levels. It's got shops and residences and all this. That's what she's thinking of when she says bridge. So think of it not just horizontally, but vertically, a bridge that's getting us up out of the water and then leading us upward to God. Well, who's Christ? He says, I am the way. See, I am the way. I am the bridge. I am the road. Stay with me and you'll make your way to God. She believed that in her bones, And she loved to talk, as a lot of the spiritual writers do, about stages, right? Different stages of development. So going from a purely servile love of God, for example, when it's the way a slave is afraid of his master, and then moving through different levels till you come to the kiss of the mouth, which is the kiss of intimacy, where you love God simply for his own sake. She has beautiful things on this spiritual progress that we go through.
One theme that also shows up pretty often in Catherine's writings is the theme of grace and how grace and human action work together in the spiritual life. Talk about that a little bit.
Yeah, I mean, I feel like all the saints, she's a doctor of grace. So we call Augustine the Doctor Gratiae, the doctor of grace. But all the saints are, because they realize, look, I'm a sinner and I'm stuck. There's the raging water again, or choose your metaphor. You're stuck you're down in a well, or you're in the quicksand or something. It's like an addiction. You can't extricate yourself, period. What you require is grace. So she knew that. And that's, very clear in the Dominican tradition, going back to Thomas Aquinas, whom she reverenced. But then, because God's grace is non-competitive, it's not an either or. So the more I say grace, the less I say works, right? No, I'd say that's Luther's logic, but it's not the logic of the Catholic tradition, which is the more I say grace, the more I can affirm my own cooperation with grace. And so there's a humanism that's ingredient in the Catholic tradition, and I think Catherine embodies that beautifully.
What would you say to listeners who I imagine are maybe a little unsure of Catherine because she maybe can seem a little unapproachable with her intense mysticism, with all of these locutions and experiences of God? How can Catherine be relatable to us ordinary men and women?
Well, first of all, I'd say in her concern for the poor and her concern for, concrete service and mission, in all those ways, I think she's very accessible. More to it, think of this familia who called her mama. I mean, she was deeply loved, and people around her weren't put off by her mysticism. They were drawn in by it. And she was known as a kind of a commonsensical, spiritual, director and all that. So I think there are many ways we could hook onto her. At the same time, I'll say this. Let Catherine be a little weird, because she was a little weird. Any of these mystics are a little frightening. Yeah, I think so. I mean, when someone is vividly in touch with a transcendent realm that, let's face it, we can't control, that goes beyond any of our imaginings or machinations or whatever, is that frightening? Yeah, it is. And I think in our secular time, with all of our buffered selves, and we're very skeptical of anything beyond this little ordinary world of ours, I like the strangeness of Catherine. I like the fact that she's a little weird and a little frightening. So I'm okay with that. Something we did film, but our director said, it's maybe just too much to include. If you go to Rome and the Church of Santa Maria sopra Minerva, you'll find where the body of Catherine is buried. But see, after she died, they cut her head off, because this is the age of relics, right? And they wanted part of her to go back to Siena. And they knew that trying to transport her whole body back to Siena would be too difficult. So they cut her head off. And they got her head out of Rome and brought it back to Siena, where it is to this day. And you go in the basilica there, and you'll see the head of St. Catherine. And how would I put this delicately? It looks like the head of someone who died, 700 years ago. My point is, it's a little frightening. And I think that's okay. I think that's a good thing in some ways, that we're like, whoa, look at that. Because her life is meant to maybe shake us out of our complacency a little bit.
In 1970, so zooming all the way to recent times here, Pope Paul VI named Catherine a Doctor of the Church. What does this title mean, and why is it significant that he named her a Doctor of the Church?
Yeah, Doctor Ecclesiae just means a teacher of the church. And so, anyone I'm a teacher of the church in the measure that I'm preaching and teaching. But when the church singles out certain people as Doctores Ecclesiae, it means that they teach in such a compelling way that they sum up the totality of Catholicism in such a complete and compelling way that they deserve very special attention. So whether we're talking about John Chrysostom or Jerome or St. Thomas Aquinas or Augustine, these great figures who are touchstones, I'll put it that way, they're touchstone teachers. And so Paul VI, I think with extraordinary grace, names Catherine as one of these rare doctores ecclesiae. And I think it's look at the dialogues, and someone who's teaching out of this mystical contact with the Lord, and whose spiritual teaching is of great and universal value. There have been comparatively few women doctors, and I think Paul VI intuited the importance of that. Now think John Paul II, who names Thérèse of Lisieux as a doctor of the church, which struck a lot of people as kind of strange because, she's no Thomas Aquinas. She's not like Augustine in the depth and profundity and breadth of her writing. Nevertheless, Paul VI in the case of Catherine, John Paul II in the case of Thérèse, intuited, but their teaching was so basic and so illuminating, and truly, in that sense, of tremendous breadth, that they deserve to be called doctors of the church. And so I think it's beautiful that those two women are named doctors of the church.
Well, let's close here with a question that we're ending all of these episodes on the pivotal players with. Why is Catherine of Siena a pivotal player?
I think today, her relevance today is in this shaking us out of our complacency, this keen sense of the supernatural order. From the time she's a little girl and she sees the vision of Jesus as the Pope, all the way through her life, she was in steady, living, real contact with a world that transcends ours. Remember that great line from Brideshead Revisited when Charles, the narrator, as he's coming kind of, toward the faith, and he says, it dawns on him that the supernatural is the real. And that's a great way to name it, because our prejudice is just the opposite. What's real is what I can see right in front of me. I can touch it. And the supernatural, that's all some kind of crazy fantasy. No, but once you get it, once the veil's been pulled back, as it were, you see, no, it's just the opposite. That it's the supernatural that's truly real, and this world a kind of participation. Hence John Henry Newman, who puts on his own, on the gravestone, ex umbris et imaginibus in veritatem, from the shadows and images into the truth. See, he got the same idea. This world is not what's truly real. The supernatural is the real. I think Catherine's a pivotal player because she's still teaching us that truth.
Well, it's time now for our regular question from one of our listeners. Every single episode, we pick one question from listeners like you. If you have a question, we'd be thrilled to hear it. Just visit askbishopbarron.com. You can record your question there, and each week we pick one to air here on the show. Today we have a question from Megan, who's in South Africa, all the way on the other side of the globe, and she's got a question related to our Pivotal Players series. So here's Megan.
Thank you. This is Megan Turner from Cape Town, South Africa, and I would like to ask Bishop Barron how you came to choose these particular 6 pivotal players from all the characters throughout history. For example, Thomas Merton, St. Augustine, Dorothy Day. And the other question I wanted to know is what's coming after pivotal players. I can't wait to hear what's coming next. Thanks.
Good. Thank you for those questions. Yes, whenever you do something like this, when you say, I'm going to do the 10 this or the 20 that, you're wide open to the criticism of, well, why didn't you choose, everybody else? So I understand that. I'll say this. In choosing people as truly pivotal characters, we wanted people who had a really massive influence on the life of the church, but then through that, a massive influence on the wider culture. So whether you're looking at an Aquinas or a Michelangelo or Augustine or Newman, some of the people we chose, Ignatius comes to mind there too, that really impacted not just the church, but secular history as well. So not just people that are great, there are a lot of great people that aren't pivotal in the same way, Here's a second consideration. In the first series, the Catholicism series, we covered a lot of women. So there was a special episode on the saints, and there were 4 women that we considered, namely the Little Flower and Edith Stein and Teresa of Calcutta and Catherine Drexel. But also in the Catholicism series, we had substantial sections on Dorothy Day, on Teresa of Avila, on Mary, the Mother of God, on Bernadette of Lourdes. So one of my principles was I didn't want to repeat myself. I mean, so obviously I think many of those women I just mentioned are indeed pivotal players, but I've already covered them, and I didn't want to do a whole other journey to their town and tell the story again. It seemed silly to me, you know. So in that way, many women that I would have chosen, we've already done in the first series. Here's a third observation I want to make. This is volume 1. So we had filmed 6 of them, and then I was named a bishop. And so the whole thing was kind of thrown off kilter. But we decided, let's finish the 6 we filmed, and let's do the next one next. So I've already finished the scripts for another 4 episodes, and they're going to be on Bartolomé de las Casas, Ignatius of Loyola, St. Benedict, and St. Augustine. I'm hopeful that even beyond those 4, I could do another 2. So that's another part of my answer, is that wait for the next volume of the remaining pivotal players.
Well, thanks for that great question, Megan. And again, I want to emphasize that now's the best time to pick up your copy of the Pivotal Players. It just came out. And if you use the coupon code Siena33, that's SIENA 33, you get $10 off. So go to pivotalplayers.com, put in the coupon code Siena33, and get your copy of Catholicism, the Pivotal Players today. Well, thanks so much for listening, and we'll see you next week on the Word on Fire show.